Hey there, students. Welcome to Sociology of Deviance. So excited to have you this quarter. So here's our first lecture, just to give you a little bit of understanding. This first lecture is really just going to introduce you to some of the main ideas, terms, and concepts from the course. If I could, set it up for you, this would be an outline for what the course is going to be looking at. So keep in mind that these are just kind of general ideas and perspectives this week. What you're going to find is we're going to go into a lot more detail as we progress through the course. Um, so as you go through and listen to this lecture, I also want to, just give you some recommendations. I would recommend printing up the lectures before you listen to them. Have a little place for notes. You can actively note take. Um, you have weekly quizzes, so take that into consideration that your weekly quizzes will come from the reading, they will come from the lecture, um, and they will also come from videos that are embedded within the lecture. So take that into consideration. It's really important that you're hitting all of those dimensions in order to do well on the quizzes. But also keep in mind that there's quite a bit of overlap as well. The readings reinforce the lectures. So just take that into consideration as we progress. And again, so excited to be spending this quarter with you. One of my favorite classes to teach. Really, really fun. So here we go. All right, so in this week's lecture, we're just going to go over some basic ideas and concepts. I'm going to fill you in on some of the sociological language that's going to be important for kind of understanding this course. And that's kind of the framework for today. We're not going to get too deep, but just again, give you some basic understanding of maybe sociology if you've never taken a sociology class. But specifically deviance. So just to start off, as sociologists, we are studying phenomenon in the social world, and we're using a scientific process in order to do that. Um, we will get maybe more into this as we progress through the course. But essentially, we are studying society. We're studying both micro and macro forces that influence us. So this class is very much the focus is on deviance. And so what is deviance? We oftentimes know that there's something weird, like it's a stigma or what. But a sociological definition of deviance looks at any kind of norm violation. And so we're looking at things that aren't normal or that deviate from the norm. And so before we kind of start looking at that, we have to understand, well, what the heck is a norm? Norms are expectations that we have within maybe a group or societal expectations. You know, that these are things we expect from the people that we live amongst, right? So you follow norms every single day. You probably do it without much thought. um, and we'll go through some of the we'll break it down because there are different types of norms. So the first one we'll look at are folkways, and folkways are learned norms for modes of conduct. So these are things that we frequently repeat over and over again. So before the pandemic, the norm was to put your hand out when you met someone. And of course, the pandemic has changed that norm or expectation. Now, it might be deviant to kind of put your hand out during this time. And so, it's really interesting. We see how norms shift and change across time, across space, and of course, across kind of special circumstances. There might be a likelihood that we will never shake hands again because this pandemic has really kind of changed the way we look at germs and that interpersonal kind of touch. So, most of the folkways are these norms of against bad taste, right? So generally you're not thinking about them too much. They're really unconscious. But these are things that you might consider, like, what's considered proper or rude behavior. This is relative to a culture. So, of course, if you go to another country, many of you are international students, you might find that, something you do here is considered rude. Um, that is not rude in your country. Or maybe you've traveled somewhere else and found, oh my gosh, I did this wrong and I felt so bad. So we know that it's relative across culture, it's generally passed down. So, when we think about folkways, these are oftentimes the things that as parents we're really trying to drive into our kids, right? So, how many times did your parents tell you, say please and say thank you? And then it became so ingrained that you don't even do it. You don't need your parents to tell you to do it. I know as a parent, I feel like once I got my kid says it like almost compulsively, and I just love it because that's who I want her to be, right? Um, so, something to think about. Folkways are the weakest norms. They can be violated. There's generally not like some heavy sanctions or punishments for violating these norms. So, if someone doesn't say thank you or please when you're doing something, there's not going to be any real punishment, but you might think that person's rude, or, something like, oh, you didn't, well, think about something like sneezing, right? Um, the pandemic has changed sneezing. I know when I'm in a store or something like that, even with my mask on, if I feel a sneeze coming on, man, I swallow that thing because now that sneeze has a very different definition from the culture, right? But when before it was just, make sure you cover your mouth. If you don't, that's a major, or that's a folkway violation. But now we might say it's a little more serious, right? So we've seen that norm change as well. When it comes to folkways, most people accept them. There's not a lot of contention around these expectations, right? And a lot of these are just, the way we do things. And generally, what norms and folkways are really important because they set the basis for our culture or how we go about doing things. And like I said, those of you who have traveled elsewhere or are from other countries, you know this, right? And maybe you learn the hard way. So the next type of norm that we will look at, they are called mores. I know it looks like Moors, and sometimes people pronounce them incorrectly, but it's technically mores. And these are norms that generally carry a great social significance. These are norms that, if you're not following them, you would be considered immoral. Um, and most of these are learned more consciously. And a lot of mores are based on kind of individual or religious doctrine, right? And generally, people feel more strongly about mores than they do folkways. So think about, I oftentimes, because it's kind of based in religious doctrine, I think, growing up Catholic and going to Catholic school, I think about what were the things that were sins, and things like, cheating on your spouse, major, you think about it's embedded in the religion with the Ten Commandments, and all different types of religions have these, and generally they're very similar, right? You shouldn't practice polygamy or having multiple spouses. A lot of people think that's a big no-no. And we've seen how this has changed in some ways, and maybe not, with looking at like LGBT groups and kind of how they were accepted or not accepted, and throughout history, right? Like that might have been seen as much more sinful than it is today. But of course, some religious groups still consider it a sin. Um, and so, these things do change, but the changes generally happen more slowly, even with things like polyamory, or being, having multiple lovers, or, people that you're with, or multiple, polygamy, having multiple spouses. There's a little bit more wiggle room than there was maybe a decade ago. It's still pretty, it's still a norm violation, pretty major one. If you go around saying, oh, I have two husbands at home, people are going to look at you pretty weird, or might look at you pretty weird. But of course, we see they do change and shift. We're kind of seeing a little bit more wiggle room around that. And my guess is because, a lot of millennials, they saw their parents get divorced. 50% of their parents got divorced, and they went through that process as well. And that's just my guess as a sociologist of why we're seeing more kind of accepting attitudes around polygamy and polyamory. But generally still a major, kind of norm violation. And again, mores, most people are looking at this more as a sinful idea. The next one we'll look at are laws, and laws are norms that are deemed so important by society that they've been codified or made into law. So sanctions for or penalties for breaking the law, they're codified. If you speed, you will get a ticket. If you, I don't know, steal something, you'll go to court. And generally, what we're going to find is that the laws represent the interests of the ruling class. And so, what I mean by this is, oftentimes there are behaviors that are just as dangerous, but they're not against the law because it's the people in power who have decided that it shouldn't be unlawful. And so we do see, behaviors by people in power, politicians, people of a high social standing, and we find that, they don't have the same kind of rules as the rest of us. This is something we've seen with presidents. So presidents kind of, some administrations have asked to pardon themselves against any future, um, lawsuits and things like that, or criminal penalties. So, that's something also to consider, is just because something isn't unlawful doesn't mean that it's not harmful to the society. But again, generally, these are representing the interests of the ruling class. Lastly, we have taboos, and these are norm violations that really elicit some major disgust. These are the strictest form of norms. And these, again, they might result in like expulsion from the group. These are things that are generally really not okay. So things like incest, cannibalism, even things like, this has changed a little bit too, sadly, but openly being racist. It's taboo to ask a woman if she's ever had an abortion, something like that. It's just, you don't do that. Um, but again, something like incest or cannibalism, we know that, incest is, if it's against a minor, that could be unlawful as well. But, if you have two grown adults who are cousins or something, and or brothers and sisters, generally that gets a pretty serious reaction. And so you're going to find that, some of these will overlap. So again, like incest is a taboo, but it's also against the law if you're doing it with someone underage. And we also can see it's also a more, a more violation, as seen as sinful. So you can kind of, but not a folk way, definitely. This is a lot more serious than those kind of, everyday expectations. All right. So, in order to have an understanding of like basic ideas of what deviance is, it's important to start off with norms. And norms are the everyday expectations that we have that really come to guide society and keep society functioning, right? So, some norms or expectations that we have within a culture are what are known as folkways. And folkways are, again, these things that really guide us through our days. Folkways are made up of learned behaviors or modes for conduct. And oftentimes, what you're going to find is these are acts that we frequently reproduce or are repetitious. So things like shaking hands, the expectations around like introductions, or we might look at the expectations around, um, you know, hygiene. You're supposed to wash your hands, right? If you don't wash your hands after you go to the restroom and someone sees you, that's definitely seen as poor taste. In terms of what we call sanctions, or which are penalties or rewards in which you get from members of society for following these norms. So, if you don't wash your hands, oftentimes people are going to maybe look at you funny. They might think you're gross. But also, folkways, a really good way to think about these are, if you're a parent or you've been around small children, folkways are the types of norms that we are reminding our children of quite often. So, In my household, one of the big ones was, hey, you better say please and thank you for everything. And I mean, we really ream this one in to the point where my kid says please and thank you all the time. It's almost ridiculous, and I love it. So I feel like I've really reinforced that one for her. It was really important. Now, again, if someone doesn't say please or thank you, you're not gonna, call the cops on them or anything, but you definitely might, look at them as being in poor taste or being rude. Most of the folkways are happening on an unconscious level. And again, these things are relative to culture, they're passed down intergenerationally. They can change if we look at the norms around hygiene as it relates to the pandemic. Some of these, what were once folkways, are looked at as a little bit more serious now. Like, if you're not going to wash your hands during a pandemic, it might get even more serious sanctions from members, or wear that mask, which was not even a norm before, right? Folkways are generally the weakest norms, and they are the ones that are most violated. So most of us at some point in our lives have been rude, whether we realized it or not. These are really based on culture, and most people accept them, right? There's not a lot of argument about, these kind of everyday rituals that we practice and norms. The next type of norm is a moray, and a moray is looked at a little bit more serious in terms of social significance. These are generally when we look at, people being immoral, or sometimes, in religion we see it as sinful. Generally, you won't be locked up for violating mores, but there might be kind of heavy sanctions in the way that, people feel very strongly about these things. So if you go and cheat on your wife, for instance, you're not going to be locked up, even though you are breaking a legal contract. But we're not going to put you in jail for something like that. But, a lot of people would look at you as immoral. This would also be true for, like alternative lifestyles, living in polyamorous, or having multiple spouses, as we've seen with polygamy. Again, there are laws against polygamy. So you're going to find that even with, mores, there might be overlap with other things. And we'll talk about that in a second. But generally for mores, we're looking at, what's considered sinful. And these also change across time and space. Homosexuality was considered very sinful. Some of those attitudes have changed. There are some religious groups that still look at it as very sinful. And of course, it shifts across cultures and place. So what's considered moral here may be looked at much more serious somewhere else. In terms of laws are norms that have been codified into law, and these generally are addressing the ideas around crime. These sanctions have been codified. And what I mean by that is they've been written down as laws, right? You shouldn't steal, you shouldn't, speed. Speeding's an infraction, but it's a written kind of a rule. And one thing to think about is generally the laws will reflect the interests of the ruling class. Oftentimes, you'll probably see that, people in power will engage in activities or behaviors that are very dangerous or hurtful to society, causing harm, but they aren't penalized or receive the same types of punishment. And so that's also something to think about in the law. Just because a certain behavior isn't unlawful doesn't mean it's not harmful. Oftentimes those in power will create the laws to benefit themselves. We know this, right? And we also know that people at the bottom of the socioeconomic kind of ladder, and people with the least amount of status, are likely more targeted when it comes to certain behaviors associated with their class. And we'll talk a lot more about this as we go. But generally, the thing to think about with laws is that there will be some kind of formal sanction or formal penalty. You'll either get a ticket, you'll get jail time, you might get prison time. You might be put on probation or parole, but generally what's happening is that you're committing something that's against the law. And again, you might see some overlap with these. So as we progress and start talking about taboos are really the strictest form of behaviors that result generally in great disgust and sometimes even expulsion from the group. Some examples of taboos might be things like incest. And of course, we know that, incest would also fall along violations of mores and violations of laws as well, but it's also considered taboo. Things like cannibalism, which would be against the law, and I'm assuming most people would find that sinful as well. So you see a lot of overlap. And, as you come to create a framework for how these different norms are kind of categorized, just keep in mind that there is, a lot of gray area. I feel like folkways are the ones that are kind of more so on their own. They're not as serious. These are just those ones where we're like, oh, that was really rude. This person cut in front of line or cut in front of me in line, or like people are rude all the time. We know this. And you might give them a dirty look, or you might give them the finger even, but generally, the sanctions aren't going to be too high. All right. And so the next thing we're going to be talking about is the way we categorize deviance. And it's really set up really nicely. We call it the ABCs of deviance. The first one being attitude, the second one being behavior, and the third being conditions. Um, the thing to think about is, there aren't always super clear lines around norms like we saw with mores and laws and taboos. There's a little bit of gray area. And the other thing to be thinking about is that all of this is really relative to time, to space, and to group, right? So if we look at something like homosexuality across time and space, it's changed significantly. We look at how even changes in the law were to legitimize this group's struggle. So, for instance, one thing I noticed that after gay marriage was legalized, I really saw the stigma around gay marriage lift. Students were more open to talking about their experience as having an LGBT identity. So that was just my experience in the classroom. It seemed like students opened up a lot more, and I feel like this allowed them to have their space to feel seen, right? And that's really important to think about. So it's relative across culture. What LGBT identities are experiencing here in the US is not true all over the world. Some people are still facing really harsh sanctions, including death, for being within that group. But also, the norms oftentimes will really reflect the cultural values. And so in America, we've had a strong influence of the Judeo Christian like values. So we see those ideals, reflective in, our culture as well. Even the Catholic Church, the Pope recently has said, who are we to judge homosexuals? This is huge for the Catholic Church, right? They've been judging homosexuals for a long time. And so we start to see how this really comes to influence, our perceptions and the way the kind of culture looks at these ideas. So as we divide these ideas of deviance, we'll start with the idea of attitude. So having a deviant attitude is an attitude that's alternative to kind of the mainstream or dominant views. These might include things like religious extremism, people in cults, for example. Even for most of history, atheists were considered deviant, in that, you don't subscribe to some sort of religion. I would say that stigma is still there, but not as much as it used to be. Also, people who take on really extreme political attitudes or racial attitudes to the point of being really extreme. Sadly, some people might see racism, especially anymore, as a norm within our culture. And if you look through history, there are plenty of examples that illustrate that point. The next dimension that we find within deviance is behavior. And behavior, in parentheses, you see here I have achieved. And what I mean by that is this is behavior is a choice that somebody made, right? So, you're deviant because of these behavioral choices you're making. So groups that might be considered deviant by behavior would be, people who are nudists, people in the kink community, subs and doms, and all of those types of people, people who engage in recreational drug use. And again, we see that spectrum, right? Because if you're engaging in marijuana use, um, still has more of a stigma than something like alcohol, but obviously not the same as heroin use or cocaine use or something like that. Um, so these groups have really earned their deviant behavior by, somehow engaging in some sort of behavior that is outside of the norms. And so you'll also see these overlap. Obviously, people have, like in the picture here, people who have really extreme racial attitudes, oppressive attitudes might engage in that type of behavior as well. But it's not always the case. People can have really racist attitudes and never, act on it. And so that's also something to kind of consider. And even, someone who engages in, involved in the kink community, for instance, they're going to have a pretty open attitude around sexuality, I'm assuming, right? So you can see how there's an overlap there. In terms of looking at conditions, conditions are a little bit different in that they can be they're more so ascribed. And what I mean by ascribed, it's based on some kind of condition that this person cannot shake or change, right? So maybe you were born with some kind of deformity that makes you stand out. That would be a condition that gives you a deviant identity. In our culture, we know that certain individuals carry a stigma just for who they are. Those individuals are Black males, especially. There's an association that they are criminal, and they've carried this stigma for a lot of history. We'll talk about this in some more of our lectures. We might look at someone who is extremely obese, or also someone who, in some ways it can be achieved and not ascribed. So if, for instance, are some kind of engage in body modification, or again, it's achieved because you became obese. But again, we know that there's a lot of kind of gray area around this as well. But we know that, people who have certain conditions that make them look different are looked at in a deviant kind of way. And as I bring up the example of obesity, the other polar idea of, being super thin is also something that's looked at as deviant. So hopefully you just finished watching the short video, a very interesting mirror. That's actually one of my friends from college. Her name is Meg, and she really got me thinking about carrying around an identity of having a condition that's considered deviant. Um, I really hope that video got you thinking about this idea of how people with deviant conditions can oftentimes hold up a mirror for us and really get us to look at our own culture and our own ways of doing things more critically. Um, One thing that I've learned as we've had guest speakers in this class throughout the years and things like that is oftentimes these deviant groups hold up a mirror for the dominant and get us to look at our understanding of the way we do things more critically. So, for instance, one of the nudists that comes every year to talk about her experience, and she runs the nudist camp in Issaquah. She talks about how, before she was a nudist, there was so much shame around her body. And I think, especially for women, we're really taught to not love our bodies. We're really taught to be ashamed. Um, and she had also faced like sexual abuse and just really had a really awful kind of experience around these ideas. And then she talked about her experience as a nudist and how that really, she loved her body, and her, just so you know, like her body image was outside of the norm as well. Like a lot of people would have considered her obese. And she was just like, oh man, this community allows me to love my body, allows me to feel free. And there was something so beautiful about this, but also it really got us reflecting about, in class how awful the dominant society is, and how, we're really taught not to appreciate and love our bodies. And we see, people practicing self-harm because of that. So this meaning and these ideas go really, really deep for us. But they can also, again, hold up that very interesting mirror to get us thinking about, who's really the weird ones here. So in terms of studying deviance, we have different methodologies that all have strengths and weaknesses, but it's really important to kind of clarify this idea that, studying deviant groups can oftentimes be kind of difficult. For one, sometimes they don't want to share their secrets or, what they're doing. They may feel threatened because they carry a stigma. They may question your, like where you're coming from with your research. Um, just some personal experience. When I was in college, I was interviewing people who were previously incarcerated on their sexual assaults, and there's a lot of reasons why um, previously incarcerated people might not want to talk about this experience with a stranger. Um, there are a lot of other aspects to that as well. Some people may not have saw themselves as being sexually assaulted, which is why it was really important in terms of our survey that we created questions that, you know, um, serve this idea that, not all types of sexual assault are kind of what we think of in its stereotypical terms, or like the shower scene, for instance, in prisons. What I found was that actually what was happening a lot is that one inmate would submit to a more dominant inmate sexually for protection. And so he or she may not have seen this as sexual assault, but by definition, there's coercion, there's manipulation, and this person is simply doing this for protection. And so when you look at it that way, the way you construct these questions is very meaningful in terms of what you're getting. Because if I had asked that person, were you ever sexually assaulted, they may have just said no. So, in studying groups, we might use things like surveys, like I was talking about, experiments, and you're going to be watching the Stanley Milgram experiments on shock theory, or on shock therapy. Um, and that experiment offered us a lot of insight, as well as Philip Zimbardo's Stanford Prison Experiment, if you learned about that in previous classes. But one of the most effective ways for sociologists to gain some inside information about these groups is to do field research, is to actually immerse themselves within the group. And what's really, and you're going to be doing this from an online focus. But this can really give us, you really have to immerse yourself within the group to get this information. What's really exciting about sociology is that if you end up majoring in this, you're going to be, your research, your field research will require you to jump right in and, and be part of the group at times. I will say it's thrilling. It's exciting. It's really, really fun. I miss it. It's also a lot of work. Um, but these are some ways that we can get some insight. I was just looking at a book review the other day. I haven't read the book yet, but there was a sociologist who actually did his field research. He like infiltrated a motorcycle gang. Um, and so, that's something to look at. That would, I would actually I take that back, because you have to have consent when you're doing this type of stuff. So that would be more of like a kind of a police thing. But you get the idea that, when you immerse yourself with any particular research design, or group, you're going to get the best results. Um, so, yeah, that's how we gain our information in terms of methodology. So the next thing we're going to talk about are the three perspectives of deviance. And again, these are really broad perspectives that we will keep kind of, bringing back up throughout the progress of our course. The first perspective we'll look at is a very absolutist perspective. Um, Absolutists believe in the idea that, It's very, significant in that it's objective, right? Deviance is black and white, right? A lot of this is based on kind of a moral, absolutist perspective. Either it's legal or it's illegal. And you might have like family members who've subscribed to some of these ideas. Um, there are individuals who would never engage in things like, smoking marijuana or something like that. But as soon as the law changes, they're like, okay. And this is this idea that, no, the law is clearly stated. There's a line in the sand. You are not to step over it. Um, and that, Durkheim believed, he was our father of sociology. He really believed that, there was a reason for these laws and that they were functional for society, in that they reflected the collective consciousness, how, everybody felt. Um, they also, but it has its ideas in it has its basis in the idea that deviance is immoral, it's sinful, it's unnatural. And they believe that you could see this if you really analyzed our universal taboos. So we find that murder, incest, extreme forms of lying and cheating, these are universal taboos, right? You're not supposed to practice incest. You're not supposed to murder anyone. And a lot, you see this basis in things like the Ten Commandments and other doctrine from religion as well. So again, this absolutist perspective is, it's a consensus perspective. The belief is that everybody believes this, right? Incest is bad no matter what. It's morality based, right? Deviance is immoral, it's shameful, it's sinful, it's objective, right? Black and white, there's no gray area. Um, and it's a really seen as a disease, right? In that it's pathological. It's you don't want this disease to kind of overtake. So what's important to think about is functionalists see, overall, they're like, this is, it's an absolutist perspective, but they are able to recognize that there is some functionality in deviance. It creates that line in the sand that says don't step over it. It solidifies people's attitudes and brings groups together. So if you look at after 9/11, this awful thing had happened. There was all this like collective, people coming together and coming together as Americans, right? Um, so yeah, let's move on to the next perspective. So the next perspective we're going to be looking at is relativist perspective. And relativists, they don't see it the same as absolutists. In fact, they say, no, 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 things are actually very relative. So deviance is very much influenced by people's perceptions and interpretations, right? What I consider deviant probably isn't the same thing as what, a normal or regular person, I shouldn't say normal, considers as deviant. Part of that is because I study deviance, right? Um, and within our group, I'm going to show you some ideas that you might go, oh my gosh, or prior to coming to this class, you went, oh man, this group was really weird, and then when you actually learn about them, you're like, oh, okay, well, maybe not so weird, like I was talking about, right? So a relativist approach is saying it's relative across time, it's relative across space. It considers the creation of norms as well as its consequences, right? Like, so if we consider, for instance, the norm of mask wearing, right? It considers why this norm was created. Well, we had a huge pandemic. And what are the consequences? Well, more people can die if we don't wear masks, right? So now, not wearing a mask in certain places could be considered extremely deviant. But even then, it's really relative across time and space. So if you are, for instance, not wearing a mask, but you're up in the mountains, I don't know, hiking by yourself and you're not really coming into contact, I don't think that would be looked at as super deviant. Now, if you're going into, I don't know, a supermarket, there you go. It's going to be looked at very, very differently. So, under the relativist approach, it's groups in society that make up the rules to fit the practical needs of the situation, oftentimes creating multiple definitions of deviant acts. So as we've talked about mask wearing, we might also look at the meanings, it's interesting what's happened to the mask, right? Um, the meanings around mask wearing have very much changed. Some people look at it as a kind of sign of patriotism to not wear a mask, as it relates to making sure that their individual freedoms are maintained. And, like, so people are looking at this idea as very, very different. And it's really interesting how even mask wearing has become politicized. Um, and even things like, from a relativist approach, even things like universal taboos can vary in definition. So, for instance, absolutists would say, murder, no matter what, is wrong. A relativist would say, well, murder is relative. It's relative across time. It's relative across space. Generally not okay to murder someone because they wronged you or you don't like them, but if they are breaking into your house, it's acceptable. If you were in a time of war and you're a soldier, it's acceptable. And in fact, you might even not be looked at as a deviant, but looked at as a hero. So we look at how even, a lot of these universal taboos, they're going to vary. Even things like incest, historically, there are reports of ancient Greeks, men having sex with young boys in bathhouses, and they were teaching them these sexual, how to be sexual, and that was actually considered very normal during the time. Even today, we're like, ooh, right? And so, it's all relative. It's relative across time and across space. The next perspective that we'll be looking at is the social power perspective. And if you've taken a sociology class before, this is going to be more of a Marxist perspective or conflict perspective, and it builds on the relativist definition. So it's still saying that yes, crime and deviance is relative across time and space, but the big difference here is that it's influenced by the people in power. It's like people in power are the ones who are making the rules and making the laws, and generally they're going to make it to be in their own interest, right? So it also would say things like that there would be different norms for them or different expectations for people in power throughout history. Or Marx's time, he would look at how the owners of production, the owners of the factory, had very different kind of norms and expectations. If we look at American history, we know that many of the empire builders, Rockefellers and people like that, if we look at it a little bit more critically in the history, we found out, a lot of people have called them robber barons. They were essentially, using their power to usurp more money and power. So again, this builds on more of the relativist perspective. It contends that the powerful groups and classes create the laws to serve their own interests. And again, this is going to be one of the perspectives that we will focus on a lot in this class. They over-enforce laws against subordinate classes and under-enforce them against members of their own group. And you'll be able to see this in this video that I have posted here, where we look at, how minorities have been demonized throughout history. And this perspective would also be most interested in considering the idea of oppression in terms of dimensions across race, class, gender, and other, dimensions of inequality. All right, the next perspective we'll look at is a social power construction. And this one builds off of the relativist definitions. But what's important to consider in looking at social power is it really considers the hierarchy of the society. Again, building on the relativist approach, it contends that it's the powerful groups and classes who actually get to create the laws that will serve their interests. And what we find is generally that certain laws are targeting marginalized individuals, while that same behavior from, happening on an upper level or higher status kind of position is punished or looked at very differently. We might look at, for instance, sex workers. sex workers that um, uh, not target a certain class, but that service a certain class are looked at differently. So if you are what's known as like more of a street walker, where you're outside, those sex workers are more likely to be more in desperate positions, drug induced sex work to pay for addiction. But then we also look at, sex workers who are serving the powerful, who are serving politicians. They have even a different name. We call them escorts. And even in the language that's being used, we see there's not the same type of stigma happening, right? And of course, punishment for both the Johns who are, getting these services, but also the women who are giving them. And that all has to do with the not the behavior, but the clientele that they are serving, right? Social power perspective would also be interested in how oppression takes place on dimensions of race, class, and gender. Here we have a little video that looks at the demonization of ethnic minorities and the history of that, in regards to drug laws and how, certain drugs were being done by whites. And they don't mention this, but it's called laudanum. Whites were doing opium in a different form called laudanum, and they found that laudanum was not criminalized, but opium was, because again, and when you watch this video, you'll find that there was so much more going on in terms of power and maintaining that power, because this was more about labor and exploiting labor. So, some really interesting things to think about. And just so you know, I really, in terms of perspective, this is where my line of thinking kind of falls along, and that you have to really look at the power constructs in order to understand why certain groups are labeled as deviant and others are not, when their behavior may be much more harmful to society. Another important aspect that we'll be looking at throughout the course will be looking at the development of the deviant identity. Um, and we'll be considering when someone will start to see themselves as a deviant, when someone starts to kind of own their deviant identity. And generally, this doesn't happen with the first act, right? It takes a while before people kind of start owning and absorbing this identity, and they may do this for various reasons. We know that when people are left out of the main economic systems, whether they go to bad schools or live in a really economic desperate area, some of this is out of survival, right? So I might turn to if I live in an area like that, I might turn to a gang. I might turn to selling drugs. Why? What's the meaning behind this? Well, being in a gang allows me for protection. It allows me for familial support that may not be there. It allows me for some type of financial subsistence, right? I can actually pay my bills. I might get some respect and status within the group. And so, all of these factors really come to be impactful, right? You can see why, when certain avenues are closed to people, why they might be okay with going down this other avenue, because identity is really important for people, right? It gives them someone to be. And again, even when you can't be known for doing something good, you might as well, consider being known for being something bad. But even then, not all, deviant identities are bad. And again, as sociologists, it's for us to develop, create an understanding or explain the reasons why, like we just did. Well, this identity provides all of these different functions. We'll also look at in detail this idea of stigma. And a stigma is a negative mark that's put on a particular person. And generally, what happens more from this social power approach, so this is an extension of that, is that, the powerful get to label what, individuals they, are bad or deviant. So we've seen in our culture, it's black males, it's the homeless population, it's sex workers, all of these people that are bad, right? Or seen as bad within our culture. Um, so these deviant individuals will undergo this labeling, and the more labeling they get, the more likely they are, to adopt this identity or this self concept of being a deviant themselves. Sometimes that, in terms of crime, that sometimes that comes with official labeling, right? I just got, maybe you didn't look at yourself as a deviant or a criminal before, but not until you got caught. You could have been engaging in all kinds of crime, but it's not until you got caught that you're like, ooh, okay, am I a bad person? And as you reflect on your own, experiences, even getting in trouble with your parents and things like that, remember when you start to go, oh man, I must be the worst person. There's a whole psychology that goes into this, right? And I know in my personal experience, I had very authoritarian parents, very punitive in their punishments. And I was just to this point as a teenager where I was like, you think I'm bad? Which I really didn't, but I guess they did. And I was like, you know what? I'm going to show you what bad is, or I'm getting in trouble no matter what. So I might as well just have fun and be in trouble anyway. And so, the more kind of associations you have with that particular definition, the more you are to adopt those. And in looking at my own life experience, I would contend that had I had different parents, it's very likely they would have just not thought I was, a bad kid at all, because I was engaging in normal teenage, deviance. So something to think about. Here we are with our last idea for the slides this week, which look at the medicalization of deviance. And this is a phenomenon that's been happening, the last 100 years, where traditionally behavior that was looked down upon is now being kind of looked at from a more of a medicalized approach. And some things that we need to kind of think about as we look at this critically is that, there are good and bad parts of medicalizing deviance. So for one, in creating, new disorders, this helps us create an understanding of maybe some of the biological or psychological differences, um, even brain differences. And there are, for instance, like trauma causes a lot of damage to the brain. And it has, people oftentimes have problems with things like impulse control. I mean, these are direct studies. You can see brain damage and how it comes to impact people later on. And so creating these new disorders can give us some understanding, can give people frameworks of understanding themselves. Imagine if you were like autistic and you had no framework for what that was, you would be very confused. And, that would be a very difficult thing. But on the flip side of it, we have to understand, in terms of what we were talking about in social power, it gives the medical community the ability, those people in power, to decide what is deviant. And obviously it gives them rewards by, giving them jobs. So we could call, something like, for instance, the DSM psychologists considered homosexuality a disorder for so long, right? And we can see how troubling that would be in creating stigma. But also it helps, create an understanding as everyone goes, well, is this a choice? Well, no, it's not a choice. And it's complex, is it? Well, it's both, right? Is it really a choice to be gay if you're going to be killed in the country, so there's a lot to think about in terms of this. Something like alcoholism, we might look at alcoholism, we're looking at it as a disease. This might create, help a person who's going through this, understand themselves. But then, we also have to look at how it might influence our perceptions of free will. If I'm an alcoholic, I have a disease, then how much of this is my responsibility? And so that's something to think about, because we see the medicalization of deviance happening more and more. A kid with ADHD 50 years ago was just considered a hyper kid. Um, Someone with a sex addiction, we might say, well, were you a cheater or are you a sex addict? It really, because it changes our approach for how we're going to try to solve these problems as well, right? Um, are you a gambling addict, or are you, is this a is just this just a these bad decisions that you're making? And so what we're finding is that the DSM is including more and more of these kind of disorders that might have been looked at very differently historically. So, when, for instance, in the book, they talk about in the next edition, they're going to include a relational disorder, and this will relate to couples who quarrel too much. And so, the other thing to think about in terms of the medicalization of deviance is it also reflects this idea of this quick fix, easy fix culture. Take a pill, get rid of it. When a lot of our behavioral issues are stemming from like the way we live, right? Why are kids, why do kids have hyperactivity disorder? Look at our lifestyles. We're sedentary now. They're sitting in front of computers all day. And I know, like, even my sister-in-law, she's like, oh, my nephew's ADHD is amplified right now. And I'm like, well, yeah, because he's sitting in front of a computer. Is that his problem, or is that like just the environment in which he's living in? So again, it helps us create this understanding, and it may really kind of lift the stigma. So again, allowing for some understanding in terms of some of these behaviors. Um, but again, kind of that conflicting idea is that it might influence our perception of free will. So that is our lecture for the week. And again, this was just to set kind of a framework for how we're going to be looking at this course. If you have any questions or concerns, always feel free to reach out to me. I'm always here for you. And have a wonderful week. I will see you soon.